I want to talk today about one of the things that's made a big impact on my life and my ministry over the last few years and what I do online here, which is an idea that's come from Renn on the three worlds of Christianity, or the three worlds of evangelicalism. If, like me, you've wondered why Christians have gone from being viewed as basically like a nice bunch of people, little old ladies who have tea parties and bake sales, families who dress up nicely and go to church on a Sunday, and that has since shifted to being viewed as a bunch of tyrannical monsters who want to destroy the world, all cleverly disguised as old ladies who have bake sales and families that dress up nicely on a Sunday, well, I think this is useful for you. And as I've said, the idea comes from a guy called Renn. He wrote an article in First Things magazine on this. He has also got a book that's due to come out next year on this same topic. I imagine that's going to be incredibly useful. I will absolutely pick it up, so big hat tip to him.
Bravo.
But it's basically the idea that the world has gone through three phases over the last sort of 50, 60 years in terms of how it views Christianity. So you have the positive world, the neutral world, and the negative world. In the positive world, I'll give his definition. He says the following. In the positive world, society at large retains a mostly positive view of Christianity. To be known as a good church-going man remains part of being an upstanding citizen. Publicly being a Christian is a status enhancer. Christian moral norms are the basic moral norms of society, and violating them can bring negative consequences. Then there's the neutral world, where all of those same things are viewed basically neutrally, so it's not necessarily good or bad societally to be a Christian. It is one of several acceptable options. Christian morality has some residual effect, he says. And then he goes on to talk about the negative world, where society essentially views Christianity and being a Bible-believing Christian as a negative thing. Christian moral values are not the moral norms of society anymore, and being a Christian essentially has some social cost. Okay, so let's talk through the basics of this one by one. So in the positive world, that's essentially been most of Western history. The Christian faith essentially formed the Western world, so it's been at the foundation of it. There were plenty of arguments over what kind of Christianity, I get that. But what he's really talking about here is the sort of 70s and 80s evangelicalism. So during that time you had a strong religious right, and the default position of both political parties was that Christianity was good, okay? So you had, for instance, Jimmy Carter entering the presidency as an evangelical. He was a Democrat, but he was, at least in his professed faith, quite devout. I think we would disagree with him politically, but he seems to have a sincere belief of some sort. Furthermore, after that you've got Reagan. He was a Presbyterian, so, you know, close enough.
Close enough! Close enough!
And then you have the context of the Cold War, which was really at its peak during this time period, and most people essentially viewed that as a conflict between the Christian worldview in the West and the atheistic worldview of the Soviet Union. And that was, in fact, actually a very true understanding of that. That is absolutely the kind of conflict that it was. You have big Christian figures at that time in the church then. So you've got guys like Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, James Dobson, Jimmy Swaggart. These guys were essentially culture warrior Christians, so they recognized the culture was maybe going in a negative direction in some degree, but they stood firmly against it. And they developed this movement that became called the moral majority, which implied that yes, these morals are under attack, but also that the majority of people in society were likely to hold to Christian views, and so they were fighting a sort of secular immorality from a position and a place of strength. You also have at this time the formation of what went on to be called the seeker-sensitive movement. So the seeker-sensitive movement, which I think we distinguish slightly, and Renn does distinguish it slightly from the sort of mega churches of the 90s and noughties, although many of them developed into that. They were kind of a prototype of this. So you have guys like Willow Creek Church with Bill Hybels, you have Saddleback with Rick Warren, essentially being founded and growing to a place of prominence in this time period. And that was based on, predicated upon, an underlying friendliness towards Christianity. They basically went around, both of these guys did the same thing. They went around their communities, they asked people, why do you not come to church? And then they formed a church and designed a church that would be the kind of church that non-church going people would come to, on the assumption that they would be open to doing so. All of this, by the way, is not necessarily terrible. Like, I know some people are going to react badly to the seeker-sensitive thing. I think there are big issues with it, But there's something good in terms of wanting to be accessible to people and a culture where people are ultimately open to coming to church. Like, that's not a bad thing. And I think what's particularly interesting is Aaron Renn talks to like an American audience, but if I look here in Northern Ireland, the same basic thing has played out. So at that time, you had a Christian positive world. Here, you had the Protestant Catholic divide, so that was a slightly different thing than maybe you had in America. But there was a very positive view, say for instance, of Catholic priests. You also would have had some more sort of firebrand Protestant preachers like Reverend Ian Paisley, James McConnell, various people like that who rose to real prominence and were broadly viewed by society, obviously discounting the Protestant Catholic thing, within their own communities anyway, even amongst those who weren't church-going, they were viewed positively. Evangelism at this time would have looked like a gospel mission. People would have put on something that was accessible to non-believers, the gospel was presented clearly, and people would come. When it comes to the end of the positive world, it's something that's quite hard to place clearly. I think there are a few things that aided the decline. One of them was, certainly in America, the end of the Cold War. Christianity ultimately won that. I know people wouldn't necessarily view it in those terms anymore, but that is what happened. In many ways, the Christian worldview proved to be more successful than the atheistic worldview of the USSR. You also had the urban resurgence. So Rudy Giuliani, this is where Aaron Renn places it, he puts it in 1994. Rudy Giuliani became the mayor of New York. Crime went down massively during his tenure. Cities became much more livable. That really impacted culture because a lot of the sort of positive world was still very much in flyover country. It's just that cities weren't maybe quite as important as they were in, say, the late 90s. Interestingly, similarly here in Northern Ireland, I would place the end of the positive world at the Good Friday Agreement, when essentially there was a cessation, or at least a major de-escalation of the conflict between the Protestant Catholic sides of the community. It was the end of the Troubles, essentially, at least as most people view it. And it was also the end of our positive world period. Okay, so that brings us into the neutral world. The neutral world basically goes from somewhere in the mid-90s through to, well, we'll talk about it, but the mid-2010s, right? So you have in this period all these major cultural phenomena: Braveheart, Britney Spears, WWJD bands, everybody likes skateboarding for a bit for some reason. It's a terrible sport, but nonetheless, people did seem to enjoy it. And the culture at this point was very much sort of a classically postmodern culture. So everyone was allowed to have their truth, your experiences matter. We can kind of have equal time for all positions. Just don't be too dogmatic. Be nice.
Just trying to be nice.
Thank you.
There you go. Okay, bye.
The attitude then within the church would have been quite different to the culture warriors of the previous period. The church essentially responded by being quite positive towards the culture. They basically would have thought that Christianity has a place within this culture. Christianity can be used here. We're not talking about removing other things from the culture, really fighting, but winsomely making the case that Christianity is the best worldview in the midst of it. And these guys genuinely did believe that that was the case. But a lot of the time they were seeking common ground and endeavouring to keep their seat at the table. So who are we talking about here? Well, various things, but you would have had the Veritas Forum, the Gospel Coalition. Guys like Tim Keller would have been massive in this period. Like, he was the sort of preeminent Christian neutral world figure. It's a respectable form of Christian intellectualism. The idea is not so much to confront, but to discuss, and I think that there was positives within that. The negatives were that they also maybe ceded too much ground on too many issues in order to keep that respectability. Christianity also developed a much more urban focus. As we said, crime was coming down, cities were becoming more livable and therefore more important. And there was an opportunity there, which was a genuine opportunity for the church to reach into cities. So you had these big things happening that would try and reach cities. So for instance, Timothy Keller, again, he wrote a book, Center Church, all about trying to reach cities for Jesus. You have church planting movements, so a few big ones. So obviously you have Acts 29. You'd have had ARC, right, which some of you will know is a massive church planting movement, very urban focused. You would have also had a Hillsong, would have been big in this time. And again, they would have done roughly what we said, which is they would have sought to seed ground where possible in order to try and make the case very nicely for Christianity. And again, here in Northern Ireland, you would have had a very similar thing going on. So a Hillsong style charismatic Christianity was essentially the norm. Vineyard grew massively during this time period. A lot of the evangelism would have been about making that winsome, nice case, so you would have had a lot of cross-community projects as a form of evangelism. Alpha would be a big one that springs to mind. Alpha is neutral world evangelism. It is, you will listen to my point, I will listen to yours, we'll have a nice, respectful discussion, and we will try, without calling anyone to repent, without using strong terminology, which I think is the downside, by the way, they would have been able to make the case for a lot of people that Christianity was the best religion or best worldview or right for them. So when did the neutral world come to an end? Well, flipping Obama, basically, okay? That's a slight exaggeration, but kind of. I mean, that's kind of what happened. The beginning of the end was the Obama administration. He starts off trying to appear as an evangelical. At the end, he's comparing Christians to ISIS, right? So things deteriorated pretty badly. The big thing in the middle of all of this, of course, was the Obergefell decision, which basically said that same-sex marriage is a constitutional right, because that's what the founders definitely believed, I think.
Incorrect.
And obviously that was a big swing against Christianity. Same thing here in the UK. The Conservative Party, they instituted same-sex marriage. Northern Ireland, actually, our neutral world, I would say, didn't come to an end until 2019 because we did not have same-sex marriage or abortion in Northern Ireland. They were outlawed or not permitted in various ways until the British Parliament decided to force it upon the province, right? So still Obama's fault somehow, not entirely sure. And of course, all of that then leads us to where we are now, which is the negative world. Christians are primarily not considered to be moral or upstanding or well-meaning. They are primarily considered to be bigoted, and the more Bible-believing you are, the worse you probably are. We've also seen the rapid advance of secularism within this. So when Obergefell happened, a lot of Christians were making the case that the next thing would be the trans issue, and that happened within about a quintillionth of a second, like immediately after trans was the next thing, because the logic holds. Like when male and female are not distinct in any way by law, the relationships between them are not distinct, well, then why have male and female whatsoever? There's also been multiple attempts to force Christians into submission to the new secular religion, so attacks on bakeries, various other wedding businesses, Christian counselling being called conversion therapy, homeschoolers, all of that. Now within the church, well, the negative world has been marked by a ton of division within the church. Basically, everybody's panicking, trying to figure this thing out. There's a couple of ways in which we have that, right? So firstly, you have churches that are caving theologically in order to adapt to the new cultural pressure. They were quite happy to leave things alone in the neutral world. Now that we're in the negative world, they feel an obligation to answer, and they're usually answering by going liberal to accommodate the culture. So for instance, the SBC has ceded a bunch of ground to critical theory, critical race theory. The Church of England has basically just decided to bless homosexuality as like A-OK. We're going to try that for a bit, they're saying. Don't know why we would trial it. Either it's the position or it's not. And though the people in the pews are maybe a bit more conservative, the leadership basically are communists and they run things and do whatever they like. So another division is between those who are attempting to respond to the negative world and those who are still trying to live basically like it's the neutral world. So those with a neutral world framework, they still want to maintain their respectability. They kind of think if we can still be just even nicer, even more winsome, then we'll get to keep our seat at the table. That doesn't mean they've fully caved, right? Doesn't mean they've fully caved on sexuality, but they have caved on a couple of issues. I think the race one they've done very poorly on, people with this worldview. They've not done good on critical theory. But they tend to think that all of the people responding to the neutral world are basically, right-wing troublemakers, which, I mean, I'm not right-wing at all, okay? I am like a normal person from the 1100s. Now, on the other hand, you've got those who are recognizing that we're in the negative world, and there's a tendency, and I'd be one of those, by the way, to think that, well, these guys are starting to compromise a little bit, and that compromise, once you start, gets it pushed further and further. It is easy to overstate the case. A lot of guys in the sort of negative world movement, they have gone very anti-Tim Keller. I think Renn, who wrote this article, adds a lot of balance to this when he talks about Keller. Tim Keller had a lot of skin in the game. He left a cushy job to go and plant when nobody was planting in New York. He was successful at doing it. He was not an evil guy. He missed it badly on some stuff. He was bad on his understanding of social justice and Marxism and race. But do I want to castigate Keller, or do I want to say that that was, you know, a blind spot that I want to have grace towards? Well, I'd rather do that. Okay, I would. Now, in terms of the Christian response and pushing back on this, there's one or two who are making some progress, right? So Rod Dreher's Benedict option is the one that Renn cites, and I agree. It was a massive book, and it was very insightful about essentially the coming persecution of Christians in the West, the need for a sort of richer Christianity to deal with this, a Christianity that goes deep, looking at things like a Christian culture, Christian businesses, Christian education, building your own, being less reliant on the systems that the world has built. He has rejected claims that this book advocates for withdrawing from the world and not fighting. He doesn't like whenever people say that. I do think if a lot of people are reading it that way, I think you have to read it carefully to not get that message. And I think if a lot of people are reading it that way, then perhaps he needed to make that case more clearly than he did, rather than just get annoyed at the readership, right? But anyway, he's pushed back, and probably the best model for doing this, okay? I know this is people are gonna wonder who I could be talking about. Who could it be? Might be in the thumbnail. Anyway, we'll find out. It is, of course, drum roll please. Obviously, it's Doug Wilson from Christchurch in Moscow, Idaho, by the way. Yep, those are the guys that are kind of doing something. It's kind of funny because Doug Wilson and those guys, I mean, they've been talking like it's the negative world for a few decades. They've been prepping for this. Okay, spiritually, I don't mean they've stored. I mean, they probably have ammo somewhere. I wouldn't be surprised, but nonetheless, that's not what they're talking about. But they're big into, like, they've developed Christian classical Christian education, if I could get my words out correctly, publishing houses, media. They're building parallel systems rather than moderating their positions to work with inside the pre-existing system. So that's the Christian negative world. That's a quick summary of all of this. No big fancy ending today. I don't have time for that. But I think it's very helpful. That's Renn's 3-world framework. So when you're getting carted off to the secular gulag for hard labour and mandatory re-education in empathy, peace and tolerance, well, you'll know how we got here. Thank you so much for watching. If you're wondering why I'm in here and not in the studio that I have, the studio's in the garage. I have a guy who is helping to fix that up for me. Very thankful to those who raised money towards that. We basically were able to cover pretty much everything, possibly plus a bit. We'll see, I might add on some things to enhance it further. But really blessed. So thank you so much for the support of the channel. If you'd like to, of course, smash, like obliterate the like button. I don't think YouTube notices with what firmness you press it, but nonetheless, you're free to do so. You could press it normally as well. Subscribe, obviously, Twitter, do your thing, retweet, all of that. Support through wearecontramundum.com, Patreon, or through PayPal, and YouTube. Next video.